Hey, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Bright Lights, our weekly, I call it excursion into the world of achievement and achievers, where we focus on people who've overcome obstacles and challenges to achieve in life. We try to focus on their perspective, their attitude, how they react to obstacles and problems and challenges, and somewhere along the line we get into just tenacity, because a lot of time in life is just not giving up, more so than anything. Now, a couple of quick things. I'm excited about our guest this evening, Mark BLaxill. Mark, Ivy League educated young man, and he's done a lot in the world of finance, in the corporate world. He has a story to tell about, and we're going to talk a little bit about autism, because if most of you are like me, we all know someone, some kid, who have been impacted by that most of the time, and it's a kind of like a mysterious type of symptom in a way. And so we're going to talk about that. Mark has been personally impacted by it, him and his family. So I'm just looking forward to talking to him about that and just all the great things he's doing in his career. Now, before we get started, remember, go out to lacyjohnson.com, subscribe, like, click the notification bell, buy some merchandise from our online store, and contribute to the program as you see fit. And so we really appreciate all your support. But we're going to get started this evening, and I'm going to bring on our guest, Mr. Mark BLaxill. Welcome to Bright Lights, Mark.
Hey, Lacy. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. So I've given you a nice little build up here. I One of the things I didn't talk about with my audience was just the Olympics. I didn't even know the Olympics was going on this year, but we'll do that another day and another time. We didn't talk about some of the police killings that happened here in Minneapolis and the whole cancel culture, but that's for another show. Since I have you on here, I respect your time. Let's just jump right into it. So, Mark, where were you born and raised? And give us some background before we get into your achievements. Give us some family background and what shaped you growing up, that would have
Well,
predicted what you've done.
all right. I was born and raised in New Jersey, actually Princeton, New Jersey. Was the oldest of four kids. My parents moved there. My dad went to college at at Princeton and loved the town. He worked in New York most of his career, and so he
Mhm.
commuted all the way from Princeton to Manhattan, which was a long way to protect his kids in the country. Princeton's not really the country anymore; it's all
Mhm.
developed. But back when I grew up, it was. And yeah, I born and raised. I ended up going to college in my hometown. Was uh, Princeton's a great school. It was a great school, but I enjoyed my family. I had a great family life. Um, yeah,
Yeah. You mentioned your dad worked in New York,
yeah,
and you said your dad went to Princeton also, right?
he did,
Yeah.
and so
What?
did two of my siblings. So we were all
Oh,
kind
you're
of
a
a
Princeton family.
Princeton family. Yeah.
What type of work did your dad, does your dad do?
Well, he passed away young.
Okay.
He died when he was 58.
Uh-huh.
But he worked for a bank for a long time. He was in finance. Worked in investment banking later.
Okay. Okay. And how old were you when your dad passed away?
I was 28.
Okay. And that must have been kind of tough. I always uh, compare myself, try to keep things in context. I think I was 46 when my mom passed and older when my dad passed. And I tell everybody, it didn't hit me as hard as it probably would have, except I met kids in college who didn't know who their mom was because their mom died before they were old enough to remember. How did that impact you? Because I know that's a very impactful life experience. So how did that impact you?
It was rough. Our dad was a hero, a great, great dad. Worked hard. Then got sick. He got cancer. He was 50, and it took a while. He fought hard to live. He did every advanced treatment he could find, but ultimately it was too much. But we all missed him. He was the rock in many respects. And my mom was great too. She passed about 10 years ago. But
Okay.
the two of them were.
Yeah. Well, once again, I'll throw my 2 cents worth in on that one. I tell everybody, once both of my parents passed, that was another big life milestone that changed my whole outlook on life and stuff like that. So, my belated condolences on that. Now, were you planning on attending Princeton all the time when you were growing up? Because that's your family's personal college.
Well, I grew up in the town. We went to the football games. There were all sorts of activities. Back then, Ivy League football was maybe a little bit bigger deal than it is today, although who knows. I was in a a cappella singing group in college, and I knew they were fun and I wanted to do it. So there was a whole life of the university that I felt sort of connected to, and my dad was connected to. I had some other options to go to other schools, but
Right.
yeah, I felt such a bond. The thing I did say that I would do is that I would get out of town every summer. So I got a summer job, all kinds of different places. I would get to experience life away from my hometown.
Well, now you mentioned something that I just can't skip over. You mentioned I never heard the phrase Ivy League football was a big deal. I'm a pretty long term sports fan. I'm scratching my brain, searching the deepest
There was a
recesses of my
Heisman
memories,
Trophy
trying to
winner for
remember was
Princeton,
Ivy League
man.
football ever a big deal.
Yeah.
I know you can put a few people in the pros, but what do you mean by Ivy League football was a big deal? I can't remember any of that.
Well, first of all, Princeton and Rutgers played the very first game of American football in 1869.
Okay, it was a big deal back then. Okay,
It
good.
was a big
Good.
deal. Yes, we invented the game. And then, Dick Kazmaier won the Heisman in 1949. So that was when my dad graduated. So it was in the 40s. I'm not sure. And then it began to be less competitive. I will acknowledge that.
Okay. Well, the one thing I do remember, this might have been a little bit before your time, about Princeton, of course, is in sports, is Bill Bradley.
Yes.
And the college All-American, went on to
Final
become
Four.
U.S. Senator. Yeah, Final Four. I think I remember, and like I say, I got a pretty good memory in sports. He might have scored 40-some points in that Final Four game, I think. I've forgotten that, but I know he lit them up in the tournament.
He was sort of my childhood hero. He went to Princeton in the 60s, and he was the scholar athlete role model that, I aspired to be in some respects.
Yeah, and he went on to win championships with the New York Knickerbockers. They beat my Lakers a couple of times. You mentioned a scholar athlete. What sport did you participate in?
I played, high school, I played football, hockey, and baseball. And then when I went to Princeton, one thing they had there was, I'm not a large man. I was, right now I'm probably 180 pounds or something like that. That's more than I should be.
Well, more than
back
all
then
of us.
I was in the 160s. And so they had a sport then it was called lightweight football. Then they called it sprint football. You had to be 158 pounds 2 days before the game. And so I played that for 4 years, for instance. It was a varsity sport.
Oh, one of those things. It's like
Played Army, Navy, Cornell, Penn, Rutgers. It was sort of an East Coast.
Okay,
thing.
so what did you major in at Princeton, Mark?
I majored in public and international affairs.
And why would someone major in public and international affairs? What are they planning on being when they say I'm a major in public and
What did I want
international
to be when I grow up?
affairs? What
Yeah,
did you want?
I didn't know. You know, my
You have to keep
mom
in
was
mind I'm a
always
techie
angling.
kind of guy. I'm an English major too, so somebody can
I
ask me that.
know.
But why would someone major in that, except out of love? But explain to me what went into that
Well,
choice.
at Princeton, they had a school, and they've actually changed the name of the school. Back then, it was the Woodrow Wilson School,
Oh yeah,
and it
okay,
was, and they had an undergraduate major, and there were some good things about that. One is you could take a course almost anywhere. You could
right.
take economics or politics or history or sociology, and that would be part of your major. And then they had a thing called policy conferences, and so it was, you know, I was more of a broad
Mm-hmm.
vision academic type. I
Mm-hmm.
liked taking all kinds of courses. I didn't want to go too. I liked economics a lot. I ended up being a business guy, and that seemed like a reasonable thing to do. But I didn't want to do economics 100%. I loved
Right.
history. I loved, you know, thinking more broadly about things, and so the Woodrow Wilson School let me do that.
Okay, and Woodrow Wilson is an interesting president too. And you mentioned that uh, the place used to be named after Woodrow Wilson. They changed his name, and I do know that he has some things in his past that can really get you in trouble nowadays.
Yeah,
I do know that he did some things with during the World War II time, World War One
World War
time
I. Yeah.
frame, and he was very involved in trying to bring peace to the world and things like that. So I guess where I'm getting to, did they change his name?
He was
Because
canceled.
you're
Uh,
right, he was canceled. Right,
he said some things that, in the context of the day, were
right,
certainly not outrageous, but would be judged as
right,
racist today.
right,
You know,
right,
I was never a great fan of Woodrow Wilson, but I think he was canceled. I mean, I would be critical of him for different reasons. He was an elitist,
right.
uh, very openly so, and he thought that, and I think that's what led to the comments that were racist, because he was very much a proponent of education
Right,
and the educated elite running things,
right, right,
and
right.
which you know, I think is wrong. I'm more of a populist by personal belief, but that was the nature of his belief system, and he used it. He was, and so the League of Nations was his invention. He
Right,
was the
right.
original globalist.
Yep, yep, yep.
And if you politically don't believe in globalism as a model of governance, you know, you're not
You
going to
don't
like
want to
Woodrow
like him.
Wilson, and that's why I don't like Woodrow Wilson. I
Right,
think
right,
actually
right,
it has
right,
led, that kind of thinking is the core of,
right.
you know, global elitism, which I don't support.
Okay.
But along with that, back in the late 19th century, early 20th century, would come, you know, a view of the African American population as somehow not part of the elite.
Right, right.
And so I think he probably said some things. I honestly haven't researched what he said that got him
Right.
canceled, but you
Well,
know,
people
he
who
was,
know me and familiar with this podcast and what I do, what other people think about me, other I never put much stock into it. People are free to think whatever they want, including Woodrow Wilson. Now, the question I have for you, and I would not ask anyone who was not an Ivy League graduate this type of question, but Woodrow Wilson, was he not also behind the president when the Federal Reserve came into being
yes,
and the
yes,
individual income taxes? And so
yeah.
that might be more dangerous than
I agree
the
with
other
you. That's
than the other
that's the
stuff, than the one
criticism of
more
Woodrow
order
Wilson.
stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, all,
yeah.
you know, the Federal Reserve System, income tax, the League of Nations,
Yep,
you know, the permanent government. You
yep,
know, he wanted to get us into World War One.
yep.
You know, so you know, those were the kinds of things that you could criticize Woodrow Wilson for, and I do.
Right. And I'm I study wars, and the fact that he wanted to get us into World War II. I was recently listening to a lecture where, well, I mean, most of these wars, you got somebody want us to get us into that. Even FDR, he basically provoked the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor. I haven't dug into that totally yet, but I just like reading stuff. So and I have heard some other things about, Australia knowing ahead of time, and we having cables and stuff like that. So we can always, I think, be how does I put this, led into wars. That's probably one of the easiest things to get us to do. And for those of you out there who are familiar with the father of propaganda, Edward Bernays, go out and read up on some of this stuff and find out how easy it is to get us into wars. Okay, so moving on. So you majored in public and international or whatever that is, and if I was your dad, I'd be wondering what you're gonna do with that. I'll be thinking I'm gonna have to take care of this guy. I'm gonna have to be sending him money for the next 10 years. But of course, I say the same thing about my oldest son who's into acting, and he's taking care of himself all his life. So, but where I'm getting to, you after graduating from Princeton, I think you started a corporate career, and somewhere in there, you decided to go back to Harvard and get your master's of business administration. So, tell us a little bit about your corporate career and the decision somewhere along the line to go back to Harvard Business School and get your MBA.
Well, I knew when I left college, I wanted to get a graduate degree of some kind. I didn't want to be a lawyer. I didn't want to be a doctor. And, what that left was sort of, by process of elimination, was business school. I wasn't sure I wanted to go to business school either. So I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, honestly, with my life in college. I graduated without a job, although I was interviewing up in Boston for some consulting jobs. I looked at New York and Manhattan and finance jobs, because that's what my dad had done. And, the jobs I might have taken, I didn't get an offer. The ones that I got an offer, I didn't want to take. And I was struggling with working in Manhattan, which was kind of a rough place back then.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
And so I applied to Harvard Business School. Is the only grad school I applied to. They accepted me, but they said, we'll accept you after you can come if you have 2 years of work experience. So they call that a deferred admission. They don't do that, as far as I know, anymore, but that was the thing they did at the time. And so I had 2 years that I needed to work before, and I said, okay, I'll go to Harvard Business School. And then I ended up getting a job in Boston for the Boston Consulting Group. And I moved up to Boston, which I thought was a great city. I loved the city. It was walkable, smaller scale, a lot of history. And so I moved up, worked for the Boston Consulting Group for 2 years, went to Harvard Business School, and then decided to go back there. And I stayed there for another 20 plus years.
Wow. Boston is a wonderful town. We've talked before, and I'm more of an East Coast kind of person. New York, Boston, DC, Philadelphia, Baltimore. I love those East Coast city with history and character in them. And by the way, another story. I believe it or not, I had the best seafood gumbo ever in Boston. And I think and the place is no longer there. I think it was a place called the Kingfish. I think something like this, Kingfish House or something like that. And it was owned by Chef Todd. And it was just the most, and I think it was by Quincy Station. Does that ring a bell?
Quincy Market, yeah.
Quincy Market, yeah, that's where it was. So surprisingly, it wasn't New Orleans. So really love Boston. I think you're right. It's a smaller New York kind of a way, have a lot of the same thing. Oh, and by the way, when I was mentioning East Coast type of towns, I forgot to mention Chicago, which is another beautiful. Well, all these towns used to be. I haven't been to them since the crazies came out and they started defunding the police and all that kind of craziness. So, okay, so you got your MBA. Just a quick question on MBAs. And I have a little corporate experience, and I probably shouldn't come at it this way, but the managers and people I knew with MBAs, I used to sometimes wonder what they're teaching them in MBA school. Don't look like they're teaching them anything valuable. And well, at least one thing they didn't teach that appeared to me was people skills. But what did you get out of your MBA studies. Name
I
me three of the main things that you get out of it. I
uh,
know there's a
I
lot of
will.
theoretical stuff, and the people I know with MBA, they talk a language that I've never heard before a lot of times. Is it to teach you a language that we've never heard of? What was the main
Honestly, I think
things?
particularly it's a 2-year program, and I'm not sure I needed all 2 years to
Right.
learn what I took away. But that's the first semester was
Uh-huh.
really one of the most exciting educational experiences I ever had. And the reason was the whole model of teaching was the case method.
Uh-huh.
So every day you read, 2 or 3 cases, and you study them. And it was a situation where a business manager was faced with a problem and had to make a decision.
Right.
And you use different tools. You had marketing courses, so there were marketing problems, or there was sort of a math-oriented course where they called it managerial economics, and you had to use mathematical analytical tools, or there was an HR human resources type of question. But in every case, you had to read about a situation and come in and have an opinion on what to do.
Right.
And I call that kind of decision making boot camp.
Right.
Five
Okay.
times, 13 times a week. It was 2 or 3 cases a day. You had to make a decision, and
Uh-huh.
so it was like exercise of the
Right.
brain.
Right. Right.
And it
Right.
was also, college was a lot of philosophy. You read a book, you talk about it, everything seems inevitable, and there's something about the case method that says, you have free will. Uh, the decisions that you make affect the outcome of life and the world. And I was inspired by that. I felt like I took a lot away from it. And yeah, I think you'd learn that eventually in the business world, but
Right.
I felt like I got up to speed much more quickly in terms of taking a big picture view of problems, and having a view that you need to act. You have an obligation to
Right.
act.
So it kind of reminds me of, and you're familiar with Albert Einstein's thought experiments, where he just sit down, you think things through, look at different angles and things like that. So that sounds like a great thing. Uh, so you mentioned your family earlier, and how many children do you have again, Mark?
I have 2 daughters.
Two daughters.
Uh,
Okay.
that at about that time in my life, I got married and started working on a family, and that was when I graduated from business school. Was the time I got married,
Okay.
1984.
And I am familiar with your writings in your book on autism. And we did talk about the fact that what got you on in that particular subject area was an experience with one of your daughters. Why don't you share that experience with the audience about your daughter and how that motivated you to dig into some things and the outcome of that? But let's first start with your
Sure.
daughter and
Well,
what happened there.
there's a little bit of a prologue there, Lacy.
Mhm.
My ex-wife and I worked really hard to have kids. We struggled, didn't we? And we went through infertility treatments, and we had a lot of, failed efforts. 10 times we went through in vitro. We had 10 independent miscarriages, and ultimately we had 2 beautiful girls. My youngest girl was actually a twin. And we know that because we saw in the ultrasound there were 2 heartbeats. And then the next time we went in, there was only one,
Oh wow.
which was,
Hmm.
pretty rough. But then she was born, and she was great. Both girls were beautiful and, lively. Um, and my oldest is 30 and lives in LA, and is brilliant and gorgeous and talented. My youngest is 26, and she was just on track in the same way. And then when she was between her first and second birthday, she began to slip away from us.
Hmm.
And then by the time she was 2, it was clear something was up, and she got a diagnosis of autism when she was 2 years, 9 months.
And what was your uh, initial reaction as a father?
Well, I had I was working my tail off, honestly, in that time, and I look back and I feel badly that I was not more on top of things.
Hmm.
My wife at the time knew that there was something up, and she was working on it, and so we finally got, we went through the process, and it was I remember it was the Friday before Labor Day, 1998. I'll never forget the day, and we walked into this one of the Harvard hospitals, and the doctor gave us the verdict of the diagnosis, which kind of has taken a crowbar to your head. And it was in the middle of the afternoon, and I was driving back to work, and I remembered reading a little pamphlet that she had given us, and she said, it's very frequently the pattern that the mothers are more aware of what's going on than the fathers are often in denial. And
Hmm.
I said to myself that was probably right up to that point, and that going forward, I was not going to be that guy. I was going to be a father who fought for my child.
Yeah, and so that led you to go out and start doing some research on autism. And I've done a little research of my own too, and I do know children with autism, and I know a little bit about the details of their lives. But I was surprised to find out that originally, and you're going to give us some data here, that it was considered mainly a condition among whites of high socioeconomic means, and now it has transitioned or segued into mainly affecting low income and ethnic minorities. What did you find out about that? Well, let's first deal with the uh, uh, frequency of occurrences historically. Tell us so what you found out about the
So what I
frequency.
did,
Uh-huh.
we went home and we cried a lot, and then I started researching, and I worked on two fronts. One is I tried to find the best experts in the world that I could to do everything I could for my little girl, and then I got online. I researched and I read and tried to learn as much as I could, and I found a community of parents that were all dealing with the issue that I was. And long story short, the parents knew their stuff and the Harvard experts didn't. In fact,
No
everything they
surprise there.
told me was, huh?
Go ahead. I say no surprise
Yeah,
there.
no surprise there. Everything they told me was wrong. There was an orthodoxy about what autism was, and that it was very rare, and that it was all genetic, and that it was all in the brain, and the outcomes were hopeless. There was nothing you could really do. You should just go through the grieving process and prepare to institutionalize your child at some point.
Hmm.
And everything I learned from the parents was that wasn't true. And the thing that I learned that most motivated me was the numbers were just starting to go crazy. They and I because I was a business guy, and I was analytical, and my work in consulting was very focused on analysis of business and analysis of problems and spreadsheets and numbers and models, and I was very comfortable with that. And I would read the science about time trends in autism and where it varied all over the world. And what was clear to me was that the orthodox view was completely and thoroughly wrong. And the reason it was wrong was that it presumed constant and rare rates. And what was obvious was that the rates historically had been really low, but they were starting to take off. And there were numbers everywhere in the United States and in other places around the world that were going through the roof. Today, those would look like really low numbers, but for us back in the day, they were just going vertical.
Hmm.
Um, and so, what I learned that I boil it down to is that once upon a time, the worldwide rate of autism was effectively zero. You look in the history and the literature of child psychiatry, and it goes back for decades and hundreds of years, and you
Hmm.
find virtually no mention of a phenomenon called autism. And then then it was discovered back, there was a Johns Hopkins child psychiatry expert who started to see some kids who were all born in the 1930s. And he said, since 1938, I have seen a condition in a number of children whose condition differs so markedly from anything seen before that, I'm compelled to write about it. But he wrote about 11 kids. And he published his article in 1943. And then for a long time, it was sort of a curiosity. Nobody saw it. It was very rare. There was a little corner of the child psychiatry world that was interested in it. And then when they started ever measuring the rates, the rates were really low, 1 in 10,000, plus or minus, depending on which study you looked at. And then around 1990, and remember my youngest was born in 1995, the rates started to tick up. And that was a phenomenon that the orthodox view of autism could never explain. What it said to me was that something environmental had to be changing in the lives of infants that was causing their development to go off track.
Okay. And then you wrote a book, came out of that. And I don't know how you found time to write a book while, holding down a job.
Traveling the world in a consulting company.
Yeah. But you did find time to write the book. I think it's called The Age of Autism. And I think in that book, if I would assume that you took on the orthodox view, that you were anti-orthodox view, which,
yes,
as an aside, you would have been canceled today. They probably would have not let you on YouTube or
still getting
Twitter
canceled,
Facebook. And I want my audience to know, and I have to interject this at this time. We are open to ideas. Our program is about business and education and ideas, and we don't censor ideas. We take them on, and we allow everybody to express their ideas. And anytime we have any guest on the show that you disagree with some of the ideas, you're welcome to be on the show and give your version of it. But having said that, you came to certain conclusions or opinions that were not popular. Tell me about that and what you went through. And anytime you take on the establishment or orthodoxy, you're in for a fight. So, what was the reaction? What conclusion did you come to?
Well, the obvious.
And what was it?
It's the question first, Lacy. What's the question that you're asking? And when you see, a hockey stick growth in the rates of something that's affecting your child, the obvious question is what changed? What happened?
Right.
And there are and remain many theories. The one observation I'd make that is most important is it must be environmental. You're not going to see a genetic epidemic. And so whatever we have seen affects so many children now, and the numbers went from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 44, or 1 in, depending on which data source you look at, the number varies. But there was one CDC study that came out, just a number of weeks ago, that said the number was 1 in 44 for children born in 2010.
Right.
So you have to, I think that increase obligates our scientific, medical, and public health establishment to ask the question, what's going on? What happened?
Right.
And there are many possible environmental explanations, but they have to be environmental.
Right.
And one of the theories, and it has become controversial, we started with a much more precise theory, and that's what I got involved in, was, there was a preservative in a number of childhood vaccines that contained ethyl mercury, which is a very toxic substance, and it was contained in relatively small amounts, but the childhood vaccine schedule increased right around that time. Right around the time you saw the hockey stick, there was an increased exposure in infants to this this ethyl mercury compound, and that was a theory. of causation. Could that have caused the problem? And I know that the public health authorities were very worried because they had immediately pulled some of the vaccines from the market, and then they started phasing out the mercury very aggressively, and they had meetings and they wrote internal reports and they did analyses. So they were really concerned that mercury might be the cause, and so was I.
Okay, so I'm I enjoy putting you on the spot a little bit, but I'm gonna put you on the spot. This is a warning. So most of us are familiar with the mercury warnings in fish.
Yep.
Give us some type of context, uh, if you can. And I know I'm putting you on the spot here. Of the concern about the mercury level in fish versus back then the mercury level in these vaccines. Is that, you understand where I'm coming from, Mark? There.
Yeah.
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 Uh-huh.
I mean, they're all different. When you get into biology and you get into the science, and I went all in because for me, I felt like I had to vet this theory, because if I was going to do something about it, I had to do it very quickly with my small child.
Right.
And so I had to test it. I knew how quickly controversial ideas move through the scientific world, and they don't move quickly. And so there would be no progress or consensus. And particularly if it was an idea that placed blame on big companies with a lot of money, it would be rough to
Right.
ever demonstrate that was true. So fish can, in particularly fish that are high on the food chain, mercury accumulates up the food chain, and a lot of predatory fish like tuna, swordfish, have relatively high amounts of what's called methyl mercury in their tissue. So if you eat too much sushi, you eat too much swordfish, you're going to be accumulating methyl mercury, which is basically mercury with a methyl group attached to it, and there's carbon and hydrogen in that, and chemically it's called a methyl, and that's not good for you.
Right.
But it's not lethal, and if it's in moderate amounts, it goes through your digestive tract. There's all sorts of things that protect you from it.
Right.
This preservative in these vaccines was slightly different. It's very similar in many respects, but it was ethyl mercury, and it had just a little bit more carbon and a little bit more hydrogen, and so it was chemically different, and so was processed differently. But it's injected, so it gets straight into your bloodstream, and then there's a whole science about how mercury with carbon elements attached to it moves around the body and enters the brain or exits the body, and there's just a whole world of science about this problem.
Well, the bottom line is, to me, and I know I was kind of mixing apples and oranges there. The bottom line is mercury is bad for you,
It is.
Anybody, and especially bad for children. Now, before I go any further, how's your daughter doing nowadays? And for our audience, autism is a spectrum. I mean, that's the low and high end, but give us an idea how your daughter is doing and
so she was always diagnosed at the severe end of the spectrum. She's doing okay. She still is pretty severe, but she's quite smart, and she communicates pretty well at this point. Her mother and I worked very hard to do all sorts of things. We changed her diet. We gave her, there were a bunch of alternative therapies of all kinds. And so we sort of threw the kitchen sink at her because there wasn't an alternative view to the orthodoxy. The orthodoxy said do nothing. Parents were all kind of experimenting with different kinds of what we called biomedical interventions. There is no magic drug. My daughter's doing pretty well.
Okay. If there was
she's going to be disabled for life.
Right.
Lacy, and she's in a group home in central Massachusetts, and she's not living independently. She needs,
Oh,
you know,
wow.
24/7 support.
Yeah. Well, a couple things. It is a spectrum. You say she's on the severe end of the spectrum, and there's another disease. And help me pronounce this: Asperger's syndrome.
Asperger.
Asperger's syndrome.
Yeah.
And I think they used to have that as separate. I think now that they folded it into the autism spectrum, if I understand that correctly, recently.
They've changed the criteria kind of in a rolling way. It used to be separately described, and then
Right,
in 1994 they folded it into the official uh, definition, and then most recently, I think it was 2013, they changed the whole thing again, and Asperger's exists no longer. It is no
right,
longer a formal, but it is kind of part of the, you know, the social discussion of autism. Asperger's was generally considered
right,
less severe, although it can be very severe. The difference historically was that a child with Asperger's would have intact language when they were infants, but have
right,
the other features of autism, which are uh, asocial behavior and insistence on sameness, perseverative quality. Those were the three criteria that were sort of historically associated with autism: language delay, social problems, and perseveration. And Asperger's had the two, but language was intact.
okay. And here's the thing: what advice would you give to parents out there who has a child, let's say on the more extreme end of of autism? Well, is there any advice that you and your support group would get out to? Because I think there's a lot of parents affected by it.
Well, I would say find other parents. That'd be
Okay.
because there are a
Uh-huh.
lot of them now, and there's a lot of support. There's a lot of groups with ideas for therapeutic interventions, dietary interventions, medical interventions. There's often core conditions that go alongside the autism. So I would just, it's often, and the one thing we know is going up fast. It's got to be environmental. There's a lot that you can do that can help. And it's not all in the brain. Sometimes it's a whole body condition. You've got immunological problems and gastrointestinal problems and dietary problems. And you can do things that can help, very practical things. So that would, and there's a lot of sort of guidebooks and support groups out there that give good advice.
Well, you and I know, and we talked about it briefly. There are a lot of famous achievers out there who had Asperger slash autism. I'm thinking, at least people theorize they did. Some currently living, some in the past. And I know this is all a guessing game, but you have names out there like Bill Gates and Elon Musk. Currently, I think going back in history, you got people like Charles Dickens and very high achievers. Uh, are, are you, what type of credibility, I guess, do you give those listed, those guests that who may have had it? And because I mean, the bottom line is you can be very talented in a lot of ways and still overcome it if you're on the lower end. But what's your thought on some of these names that they're throwing around out there?
I think that's wrong. I don't think Bill Gates is autistic. There's a
Yeah,
difference, Lacy, between
I don't think so. You go ahead.
an autistic diagnosis and
Right,
traits. We've
right,
always
right.
had
Yep.
smart, introverted people, you know, scientists by their nature or scholars by their nature. They read books, they're introverted. They don't, you know, they don't like parties much. That's not the same thing as having a lifelong disability
Right.
where you can't live independently.
Right, right. Okay, and that's a very good input. Now I know the Age of Autism is not the only book that you were involved in. You were the author of that one. Tell me another book out there that, and I forgot the name of that you were involved in on autism. Uh,
I wrote a book, Lacy, called Denial, which was
uh,
around this phenomenon that really concerns me, which is that as autism rates have gone from effectively 0 to 10,000 to 1 in 44, and they're still rising, there's no
Right.
end in sight to the
Hmm.
increases. Everybody says, oh, well, we don't really know why. We're not really concerned why. But the only thing we know is we're doing a better job in the medical community diagnosing the condition. And it's probably just better awareness, because there can't be a real problem. And I look at that situation and that belief system and I say, whoa, wait a minute. Every number, every data point, every bit of quantitative evidence that we have about rates shows that they're going in one direction, and that's straight up.
Right.
And, you know, and there's no way that you can explain that with better diagnosis. It's not, some people like to say, oh, well, intellectual disability, what we used to call mental retardation, that's declining and autism is going up. So we're just substituting diagnoses. That's not true. I've written some science and published some science that shows that that's not true. Some people say, well, it's just Asperger's and we're including more in the autistic spectrum. No, we're not. And I don't, yes, we included Asperger's in 1994, but that's not enough to explain the explosion in rates of the severe form. The other is, well, they were always there and we just missed them. And that's just, Lacy, that's an absurd argument. You don't miss a child with autism. That as a parent.
Yeah.
So all of those arguments are just false, manifestly false. And they're irresponsible to make, because if the numbers are going up the way we're seeing, we don't have many grown-up seniors with autism, but we have millions of children, and those children are going to grow up and their parents are going to die and they're going to be all alone, and we're not going to have money to pay for all the services that they'll need and all the support that they'll need. So I wrote a book called Denial that basically takes on that perspective, that wants to whitewash the problem and tell us that everything's just hunky-dory.
And I don't know, I think it was an article you read, and I'm gonna get the name correctly here, I wrote it down, on autism tsunami, the impact of rising prevalence on the social cost of autism in the United States of America. And I'm just segueing about what you just said. Tell us a little bit about the economics or cost of autism now, and if we look in the future when a lot of the parents are gone and things like that, the impact of it in the future.
Well, if we say, and this is, I make it kind of concrete, the article that was written in 1943 where Leo Kanner discovered autism, he had a case number one, a fellow named Donald Triplett. He was born in 1933, I think. And I've met him. He last I heard, he was alive and he was doing pretty well. He was living independently. But he was, born in 1930, he was in his 80s when I met him. If he's still alive, and I don't stay in touch, he'd be in his 90s. And that would be the age of the oldest individuals in the world with autism. And there are not many. And my co-author and I, we looked up all the 11 cases in that first paper, and we found 8 of them, and several of them died young. We met 2. One was this fellow Donald Triplett, and another one was a non-speaking man who was living in a group home with intellectually disabled elderly people in northwestern Maryland. And his life was, he was well taken care of, but he was all alone. And so those people were out there, but they were very few in number. And now, and we have data on some of the populations. We have data on the population in California of adults with autism. It's very, very low. People try to claim that it's higher than we think, but no, you can't find these people. And then we know that the rates in children are just enormous. They're in some places 3, 4, 5% rising, and we haven't seen the peak. And if you then project that population wave forward, and that's why I say it's a tsunami. It's it's going like this, and it's gonna keep going, and it's straight like that, and it's and each individual with autism, there are social costs to that don't go along with a typically functioning person. And it goes from special education and higher medical costs when they're young to residential costs and day program support when they're older, the lost productivity that parents have when they have to spend all the time taking care of their child, the lost productivity of the adult with autism who is going to be unemployed and basically not contributing economically to society. So all of these are costs, and we took that population rate that we see by birth cohort, we projected it forward with the growth of the population. We put you multiply the number of people in each age group by the cost, the different kinds of costs that go along with it. And long story short, the model said by 2040 we're crossing about $1 trillion a year of costs. That the rates are low now, mostly because the population is smaller and young, and the parents are doing a lot of work to take care of them. But as the population, as they grow out and they require as adults, the number crosses $1 trillion in 2040, and by 2060 we're talking on the order of $5 trillion a year in social costs.
And I'm assuming some of that cost is for our public school system. And I do know that, generally speaking, and there's some details, that they are really obligated, has the responsibility to educate these children.
That's right.
And generally speaking, they have the responsibility to bring to bear any services that need to be brought to bear to educate these children. So I'm wondering whether or not our educational budget is reflecting some of these additional services. And I know a lot of these additional services, the money comes from the federal government. So if I understand the situation correctly, and that there's going to be a lot of money coming down that's going to have to be allocated to our public school system if those type of responsibilities stay in place. But anyway, go ahead and address.
Huge special education costs crowd out other activities in schools. School budgets are swamped with special education costs. A lot of the funding is local. Some comes from state and federal sources, but a lot of the funding is local. And there is an obligation, Lacy. You're absolutely right. The Individuals with Disabilities and Education Act made it a requirement that we provide educational services to individuals with disabilities, especially including autism. The difference is that when they age out of the school system, and so when they, depending on the state, whether you turn 21 or 18 or 22, in Massachusetts, where my daughter lived, when she turned 22, she was in a whole different system. That she left the schools, and then you get into a services system where services are not guaranteed; they're just provided, and you have to become eligible, and that's a whole different world.
So now you did some research, quite a bit of research, and I tend to lean towards your view of the situation. I mean, what were they calling the kids with autism, especially on the extreme end? If they had seen it, I think they would have been counting it. But before I go there, you mentioned, I think it was Leon Connell.
Leo Connor.
Okay, Menosa. And was he the one that you met and that you said discovered autism? That's an interesting word, discovered. But did you say Leo
Connor was the world's leading expert in child psychiatry. He ran the child psychiatry department at Johns Hopkins in the 30s, and he wrote the first textbook called Child Psychiatry. It was published in 1935. I have a copy of it somewhere. there is not a single mention of the word autism. And
Oh,
it's
okay.
a 500, 600 page textbook. And then, because he was the world's leading expert, parents who started to have kids with this condition would find the world's leading expert, and they would take him to Baltimore and meet the great man. And
Uh-huh.
he met an individual. This was the child that was born in 1933, and he was born in Mississippi, and his parents took him all the way up to Johns Hopkins, and Leo Connor saw this kid, and he said, "This is not like anything I've ever seen before." And so, and then he began to talk about it with his colleagues, and he realized there were some other young children with similar profiles. And so he pulled them all together. He found 11, and he wrote about it.
Oh yeah, right,
And
right.
that was, and he's credited for discovering autism. Well,
Right.
actually, autism discovered him because he was the expert. The parents discovered autism. They found him, and he wrote about it.
I can't leave this subject without asking about the basic apparent less occurrence in the people of high socioeconomic situations and how it kind of transferred to greater appearance in people of lower socioeconomic groups and ethnic minorities.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts, conclusions, or opinions on why that is, and what do you base those thoughts, conclusions, and opinions on?
Well, this initial group, this is an interesting sample, this 11 group,
Uh-huh.
all the parents were highly educated. They were all white. They were often professors or doctors. They were, and this is what we wrote about in the Age of Autism. One was a pediatrician. Others were treating syphilis patients and using mercury in their practice. Others were pathologists or working with pesticides, some of which included this ethyl mercury ingredient. And so the parents were sort of introverted. There was a period where they blamed the mothers, that the cause of autism was the refrigerator mother. And so, because the mothers were sort of professional, they were often, had jobs, they were working, they had gone to college, which was not as common in the 30s. So, and the other thing, Lacy, that was fascinating, and if you read the historical literature on prevalence around the world, a lot of it, a lot of us, we focus in the U.S. because there's a very clear set of data, and it's easier to corral the history. But there were autism surveys in Japan and in the United Kingdom and in Sweden, and so they varied over time, and the rates varied around the world. Somebody decided, I'm going to go look for autism in Africa. And the less developed economies of the world. And what they found was you couldn't find it in Africa. There was no such thing as autism in Africa. There are high rates among the Somali population here in Minnesota, for example.
Right.
And the parents there will tell you there's no word for autism in Somali, in their native language. So, except there were rare cases of autism in African families, but they were almost universally the children of elite parents, people involved in global organizations, global corporations, in the government. And so it was very much a class division, even when you found it in Africa. So that was sort of the original picture. And that's changed now.
So thinking logically, you mentioned a comparison. Well, let's take this in order. You mentioned that this ethyl mercury was also being used in like syphilis experiments. I think you used the word experiment, study or whatever.
Yeah, go. Well,
syphilis study. And by the way, correct me.
Big question.
Correct my impreciseness when I'm done here.
Yeah.
well, where I'm getting to is if that same ethyl mercury was being used in other areas, were they seeing a similar cause and effect, a spike according to the relative usage of that in these other areas?
Ethyl mercury was only used in fungicides.
Oh, okay.
So one of the things we found was that there were these clusters of parents. Some of them were doctors in the greater Baltimore area, and some of them were working with plants and trees. And the one common feature to this group of 11 parents was that, they were all in this ethyl mercury ingredient was invented in the late 1920s and commercialized in the 30s. So that was kind of our observation, was that was consistent with the causal hypothesis that these organic, this ethyl mercury ingredient could be good at causing autism, right?
Right.
Syphilis is a whole different story, and we wrote about that in the Age of Autism at some length. Syphilis was a very horrible disease. It was the AIDS of the 19th century and early 20th century. And what they typically would do would be to treat it with mercury-based products, not ethyl mercury, not organic.
Right. Okay.
Mercury,
Okay. Gotcha.
different kinds of stuff. And they would
Okay.
rub ointments on the skin. And
Gotcha.
often, and so the observation was some of these families with an early autistic child might have had some kind of occupational exposure to medicinal mercury compounds, not this organic one, but
Right.
but other compounds. And syphilis was, until the invention of penicillin. And by the way, penicillin, you want to talk about medical miracles, penicillin and antibiotics were the greatest invention in the history of medicine. They wiped out syphilis, within years of its invention. But before that, there was nothing to do. Syphilis would never go away. It was a chronic condition and often got into the brain and eventually killed people. There was a controversy about the use of mercury in syphilis, and we wrote about that in Age of Autism.
So another question that comes to my mind, and we've already talked about these experts and things, but what I'm trying to figure out, Mark, and you can explain it to me, these people who are coming up with these treatments involving mercury, I'm assuming at that time most of them knew that that's probably wasn't a good. They knew of its bad, its harm. I'm assuming in most cases. Did they find out about that later? Why would they ever use mercury for any type of medical
they
type
used
of condition?
It because if you used mercury, you put it on some kind of bacterium, including syphilis, it diminished it. Mercury has properties that kill bacteria. And so it was active.
Right.
And anything that's active, you say, okay, well, a little bit might kill a little, let's give them some more. Mercury, for many conditions in the 19th century and the early 20th century, was the standard of care, Lacy. They gave it out all the time. And there are many illnesses and sicknesses that you can read about that have left our medical history and our collective consciousness that were obviously related and harm from the drug that was being administered. And and we write about that some in the Age of Autism. It's a historical view of the use of mercury in medicine, which was just terrible, and it harmed and killed hundreds of thousands of people. I'm sure. I don't know what the exact toll is hard to gauge, but it didn't work. It was awful. You should have stayed away from the doctor if you had syphilis, because they were gonna pour mercury into you and have you drink it and rub it on your skin and have your loved ones rub it on your skin, and it was doing nothing but negative things.
So I got a couple quick items to deal with, and then we'll start wrapping up out of respect for your time. But a couple of things you mentioned also, And I've seen, in Minnesota, we got a large Somali population, and I've seen quite a few young Somalis with evidence of
Yeah.
autism. But you mentioned that it's a lot rarer, I think that's a word, in the Somali community, I think you did, in Africa
Yes.
than it is in the Somali community here. And that would tend to, I would think, back up your belief that it's environmental and not hereditary.
Yeah.
Uh, any, what type of numbers are we talking about as far as if you know? I know it's off the top of your head as far as the difference between the population here versus the population in Africa. And well, I'm gonna stop giving you compound questions, so I'll let you answer that one first.
Um, we don't. I'm not up to date. If there are studies that have, last I looked, there was no good data on autism in Somalia. But
Okay.
the world has a way of producing new knowledge, and there might be something there. But I know that the studies that were written about Africa back in the 60s and 70s, they couldn't find autism.
Right.
There was autism here. There wasn't much autism in Africa, except among rare cases of children of elite citizens of the African countries. In Minnesota, they've done some work. Minnesota is now part of the CDC's official tracking system for autism rates, which is
Hmm.
generally a mess, but at least it's a consistent attempt to measure every 2 years and put a hard number on what the autism rate is based on a sample of locations. And Minnesota has now entered that sample. Before we entered the sample for the CDC, there was concern about autism rates within the Somali community, and they were, raising, raising
Raising.
concerns, complaining, what's
Uh-huh.
going on here? We don't have autism back home. And there was a study done by the University of Minnesota, and at the time, the rate of autism in Somali children here in Minnesota was the highest that had ever been recorded.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's a problem. I'm the CFO of an autism treatment center here in Minnesota, and we have a large Somali population among the kids that we serve.
Okay, and I'm circling back around. So once again, it seemed to have become more prevalent in poorer and ethnic minority communities. Based upon once again your data and research there, do you have some type of plausible explanation as to why that is true? And not that everything can be explained, but uh,
Well,
we can try.
Lacy, I believe in science. I believe in the
Right.
scientific process. I believe in evidence, and we need to scrutinize evidence carefully, including scrutinizing evidence that where powerful people try to cover up the problem.
Right.
And
Uh-huh.
I think that's a lot of what we've seen, because the CDC doesn't want to find the cause of autism, in my view. They
Right.
just consider it an interesting problem, and they get into uncomfortable questions where environmental factors play a role, and environmental factors are man-made.
Right.
They could be pesticides, they could be food products. We could be doing different things to our food supply. They could be medical interventions, and it's a third rail here is the
Right.
role of the childhood vaccination schedule in whether or not we've made more kids sick. Has that been a contributing factor? And we know for a fact that there is a vaccine injury compensation program, and we know that many cases have been settled where the injury that was compensated was neurological and the child was autistic.
Right.
That's a fact. Now the question then becomes if vaccination can result in autism, which is the weasel word they use,
Uh-huh.
how often can that connection happen? And we don't know the answer to that question. I know, for example, there are unvaccinated children who have autism. So
Uh-huh.
vaccines can't be 100% of the problem, but it's certainly not zero.
Right.
And then somewhere in the middle, And then the thing about vaccines is that they would sort of fit the profile. We see autism in every state in the country. We see it in every ethnic group. We see it all over, in rural communities and urban communities. And so the exposure has to be the kind of exposure that's pervasive.
Right.
It can't be one smokestack, one bad manufacturing facility, one kind of food. It would have to be pervasive.
Yeah.
And that gets us to the issue. And the hypothesis of vaccination is a meaningful one.
So we're going to start winding down here. I know that the vaccinations are in the news even nowadays. Yeah. We know that there will always be a certain part of the population who does not trust the makeup of the vaccines, and we can see both sides. At least I can see both sides of that. Do you see any commonalities? I know they've, just like you, they've censored and canceled Joe Rogan and people like that. They don't want people giving the other viewpoint. And I have to say this, to be honest with my audience. My personality is, whenever I see someone trying to shut someone up, I'm suspicious of the person who's doing the censoring.
Yep.
And I would suggest to my audience, and I normally don't get into this, that if someone is trying to censor someone, distrust the censor first, rather than the person being censored. That's just my general rule. And like you, I like to do a lot of reading and data and facts and things. And that's when I came up with that rule, because, when you start digging behind the scenes into the details, a lot of times it looks like the person being censored, the facts and data and things are on their side. But how do you see some of the current controversy and discussion going back and forth on the vaccines? And do you see
one thing I've learned, Lacy, is I think the government is not a trustworthy servant of the public when it comes to safety and efficacy data about many medical products, including vaccines. We've centralized the data collection. We intimidate scientists. The National Institutes of Health, where we have Francis Collins and Tony Fauci, they are the biggest buyers of scientific research in the world. And so if you're a practicing scientist in America today, you don't want to get on the wrong side of Tony Fauci or Francis Collins.
Right.
Otherwise, you're out of business.
Right.
And we know, for example, that with COVID, Tony Fauci's institute was funding the lab that some people suspect was playing with fire and may have created the virus and the COVID virus and it escaped. That's increasingly accepted as a plausible scenario. Right. And so if you're Tony Fauci and you might have been involved somehow, maybe you didn't fund the project that created the particular COVID, but you're funding the lab and you're involved in doing gain of function research. That's playing with fire.
It is serious fire.
Serious fire. And if something bad happened, something catastrophic happened, like millions of people dying of a leak of this virus, what's your motive?
Right.
It doesn't look like their motive was unvarnished, looking for the truth. They wanted to shut down the idea that it might have come from a lab.
Right.
And so that's that behavior that we see in COVID. And then vaccines are magical. They are 100% safe and 100% effective. And we got to mandate that everybody gets 100% of the people need to get them, and they're not allowed to question. And if they do question publicly, we will shut them up. And that's the playbook. Yeah. And they ran it in autism, and they've been pretty successful in shutting down the concerns over environmental causes of autism. But now here we're seeing it in COVID, and they're telling everybody, you're going to lose you get the shot, you're going to lose your job. That's why we have the convoys in Canada and coming up all over the world. We increasingly have pushback, but it's a very similar profile because the authorities, the public health authorities, behave the same way.
Right. And I've done some reading. We'll have to have you back because there's a lot more to this whole COVID thing and this gain of. In fact, I'm going on record saying this gain of function research to me. I'm not an Ivy League scientist or anything. I don't need to be. I don't care if you got a PhD in science, but an Ivy League. It's just dumb. I mean,
Don't make,
yeah, it's just
don't
dumb.
play with dangerous
Yeah,
things.
it's just
Don't
dumb.
experiment with ways to infect humans more effectively with a nasty virus that can kill you. Don't try to make it better. That's what they're doing.
I
It's
had
what
a
they did.
I had an interview with a reporter a few weeks ago on the subject, and my first thing with him, and even now, I just don't understand. Uh, uh, to me, we're gonna get over this COVID thing, but to me, one of the main things we should be discussing is why are we doing this? Why are we doing this gain of function? And we should say we need to stop. The people need to insist that they stop because, to me, the way I look at it, Mark, we are creating these little tiny microscopic invisible Frankensteins that can go out
Absolutely.
and have billions and trillions of other Frankensteins.
Yeah.
And we know eventually they're going to get out. So it's the dumbest thing in the world to me that we're even doing this.
And then what's
Dumb.
even dumber, Lacy,
Yeah.
is you take the people that gave you those Frankenviruses and maybe were careless with them and maybe let them out. And I say maybe because
Well,
you
yeah,
never know
that's
anything with
yeah,
certainty.
that's a debate. Uh-huh.
Yeah, but you got to say maybe.
Yeah.
But you take those people and then you put them in charge of
Yeah.
of our economy.
That's a
If
good
you're
point
letting
too.
Tony Fauci, mandate masks for children and keep schools closed and shut down businesses because they're not essential. I mean, in what world do the incompetent bureaucrats that may have given us the problem get to run the solution?
Yeah.
And we gave them a runway for a couple of years, and we're still, they haven't shut it down. The mandates haven't worked. Nature has a way of escaping the brilliance of
Yep.
human technology, and it's thankfully it looks like it's running its course. But I think we need to hold the possible originators of this thing accountable. We need to find out what happened and why, and we need to get their vice grip off of all of our daily lives.
This is a good way for me to end up the way I was intending to start off about the Olympics, and I can't believe we even holding the Olympics in China. And when you read the history of world pandemics, a lot of them starts in China. And and I'm just going on record right now. What's amazing to me that no one nowhere is holding China accountable for this. And I have read some places where Wall Street kind of like China, and I've also read that a lot of the scientists that are setting up these labs and even the Wuhan lab are your Ivy League cohorts that's going over to China and setting up these labs and things. So there's a lot of American involvement in there. And I'm just curious as why we're not being educated on the history of this thing, number one. And number two, ending it like I started off. And it's a pet peeve of mine. Nobody's holding China accountable for any of this stuff. And they keep releasing these things on the world. So there's something behind the scene that explains it. But if we get into it, Mark, we might be canceled. So we're going to end it here. And I'm going to thank you for being on the podcast. I'd like to have you back and to delve into some of these areas because, like you, I like to go out and deal with data, facts, numbers, and things like that, and not necessarily anecdotal, and just really do research. And I think this is the most important thing. Wherever the facts take you, I don't mind being wrong, and totally off the out in left field or something. If the data prove me wrong, I'll be happy on that. So let's keep monitoring autism. I know there's a lot of parents out there impacted by this, and even more important than the parents, just a lot of uh, kids with a lot of potential that we need to get to the bottom of it. And the interesting thing about it, and maybe it's me, Mark, Why don't we hear anything reporting about autism in the? I mean, you hardly ever see any articles, and it's almost like uh, families affected by autism, they're in their own little world, and nobody else really paying any attention to what's going on there. I don't know how you explain it, but I'm not going to have you answer that because we're going for another 5 minutes. I'm going to once
I
again,
know.
I'm going to once again just thank you for being on and giving that input and your background. Wish you the best with your daughter, and we're going to talk some more. And once again, to all the families out there who know an autistic child, is there a place that you would recommend they start as far as resources? I know maybe just Google parent groups, autism groups in their area or something like that. What would be one of the main things you lead these families with as we?
Good question, Lacy. I know there are. I would find local parent groups. I know there's a
Uh-huh.
group called TACA that
Okay.
there's one in, there's folks in Minnesota here. My daughter's 26, so
Yeah.
I'm at the
Right.
other
Right.
end of the journey. So
Right.
I'm
Right.
not a little bit out of touch, but
Okay.
that would
Well,
be
well,
what
well,
I
keep
suggest.
up the good work. Hey, I know you're serious about some of the issues now that you're planning on. Uh, Boy, you're brave. Stepping into the world of politics. Tell our audience what you're doing there and why you're doing it. Right quick.
Uh, I'm running for Congress in the 3rd Congressional District, Lacy. I've served the Minnesota Republican Party a little bit. Last year, I was the treasurer, and I, you know, uh, feel passionately about public health, rational health policies, economics. I'm a business guy. I do care a lot about cancel culture and the cultural trends that we're seeing where you can't speak freely, and especially conservative voices are dealing with censorship. So I'm motivated to getting deeper into the mix and get into Congress, running against Dean Phillips in the 3rd district. I just jumped into the race a month ago, a little less than a month ago, and it's a new journey.
Well, you're pretty close to my age, and I think you remember Senator McCarthy and going after the communists and how they blacklisted people. And there's a general uh, proverb that abusers, a victim or victims, grow up to victimize others. And where I'm going to there, it's amazing to me that the people who are quote unquote victims of cancel culture back in the 50s because of McCarthy and communism search are
Yeah,
the same people that's doing it to others now. Yeah, I mean, it just
that's that's an interesting twist.
it's you would
Absolutely.
think that they would know their history and know that someone has done that to them, and the last thing that they would want to do is be like that. But it's just
Yeah,
people, man.
that's a
Okay,
whole other conversation,
that's a
Lacy.
whole other
Yeah,
conversation. But thank you very much, Mark. Go have your dinner. We'll talk very soon. Enjoy the
great to
conversation.
great
All
to
right.
chat, Lacy. Thanks for having me.
All right. Okay, everyone. Thanks for watching us this evening. Had a little chat on autism there, and there are resources out there for you to find, and you might just want to Google local parent organizations in autism and start there. But it is a serious issue that we need to get to the bottom of, and hopefully we'll keep on working until we find some solutions to help reduce this the currents of it. So good night, everybody. Tune in again next week. Bright lights. Go out to lacyjohnson.com. Subscribe. Click the bell for notification. Support the online store. Donate to the podcast. Good night. We got a special guest for you next week that you'll be hearing about. We got world champion boxer on, and he's done some great things. So, good night from Bright Lights and Lacy Johnson. See you again next week.